Hello, and welcome to DSci 522 Workflows for Data Science, Lecture 8. This is our reproducibility wrap-up. Here are the learning objectives for this lecture. So by the end of this lecture, you should be able to build a Docker image from a Docker file on Github Actions. You should be able to run a Docker container non-interactively to run some software like a makefile. You should be able to version Docker images and report the software and package versions. You should be able to articulate why reproducibility is so important for data analysis. And finally, you should be able to choose the appropriate level of reproducibility workflows or tooling based on your project's complexity and desired shareability. Let's now talk about building a Docker image from a Docker file using Github Actions. Building a Docker image from a Docker file using an automated tool lets others trust your image, as they can clearly see which Docker file was used to build which image. In this course, we're going to be focusing on a tool called Github Actions. It's a continuous integration tool that's often used for running test suites in your code. However, we can use it to do other things like build Docker images. We're choosing this tool over other tools such as Docker Hub because it provides a greater deal of nuanced control over when we should automatically build our Docker image and how we should tag them when we do. Now I'm going to demonstrate how we can use Github Actions to take a Docker file, create an image on Github Actions, and then publish that to Docker Hub. So here I'm sitting in a demo GitHub repository where I have a Docker file that I have already checked that it can work on my laptop. So that's step one. It should be working on your laptop when you use Docker build before you try to start an automated build. Once you've done that, you can put it on GitHub and we can start setting up GitHub Actions to do this. The first thing that we're going to need to do with the action is it's going to be pushing it to Docker Hub. So we need to create a Docker Hub repository for our image so that GitHub Actions can push it there. So let's go to Docker Hub now and do this. So I'm going to click Create Repository, and then I select here, you have a drop-down menu, my personal account, because that's where I would like to create this Docker Hub repository under. And then I have to give it a name. I'm going to call it the same name as the GitHub repository for simplicity's sake, Dockerfile Practice. It doesn't have to be this, you could name it whatever you would like. Then I'm going to make it public. And that's typically what I do with Docker Hub repositories, because it's just it's just Python, it's just the packages. There's nothing really proprietary or secret about these things or any privacy concerns, because we typically don't put our code and we don't put our data inside of the Docker image, right? We add those things at runtime. So that's why it's generally okay to have your your container repositories be public. And then we're going to come down and we're going to click Create. So now we've created a repository on Docker Hub where our Docker image will live, which we can pull from later. So now let's go back to GitHub. And this is where we're going to set up our GitHub Actions. We're going to go to the Actions tab. And we're going to set up a workflow ourselves. GitHub gives a bunch of suggestions of places you'd like to get started, but I have a nice workflow that I want to use for this course and one that I use in my own work that nicely versions the Docker image and the GitHub repository to have the same tags so that you know which version of the Docker file built which Docker image. So let's click on Set Up a Workflow Yourself. And then what GitHub does is it kindly gives you a template that you could start filling in if you wanted to write this from scratch. However, please do not feel that you need to do this. I have given you a link to this repository, GHA_Docker_build, where you can use a GitHub action that I've already crafted that does exactly what we need it to do. So GitHub action workflow files live inside a hidden .github directory and in a subdirectory called workflows. So if you go inside here in this repository and then open the publish_docker_images.yaml file and click raw, you can copy the YAML file text from that repository into your project's repository. specifically into a YAML file in .github/workflows. Now, projects can have multiple GitHub Actions workflow files, these YAML files, and so it's really worthwhile naming them something useful. So I'm going to call this one publish Docker images, or publish Docker image, because that's what it does. Now, before we commit this, let's go down to the very bottom, and on line 38 of this file, it specifies who the user is on Docker Hub and what the repository name is. So you are going to have to change this if you use this file, and I'm going to have to change this because this was crafted for another repository with a different Docker file with a different Docker Hub repository. So for me, the username can stay the same, but I need to change the Docker Hub repository name to Docker File Practice. And that is the only thing that you should have to edit in this file. And then we're going to click Start Commit. And I'm happy with this commit message of create publish Docker image.yaml because that's very much, in fact, what we just did. And then I'm going to click Commit New File. Now let's take a look at the file and discuss what it does. So, at the top of this file, we have what's called the trigger. This tells GitHub when we should run the action, and it's very readable. On pushes to branches main, so when somebody pushes to main, and in particular to the path Docker file, then this workflow should be triggered. So you can change this and customize this to have it run whenever you want, but I think this makes the most sense for a Docker file. Then we can take a look at what else this file does. So under the steps, we get different, steps in our action that do different things. So this first one here checks out our code onto the computer on GitHub Actions that's going to run this, and we call this our runner, that computer. Then we have a step that looks at what is the current version of the GitHub repository and decides what's the next best version to bump it to. Then we have a step that uses that version to create a release and tag the GitHub repository with that release tag. And then finally, our very last step builds the Docker image from the Docker file, publishes it on Docker Hub, and also tags it with the same tag number as what we tagged the GitHub repository with. So in this very last step, you'll also see these large environment variables, Docker_username and Docker_password. We have to set these up because GitHub needs to authenticate into Docker Hub to be able to publish the Docker image there. So GitHub Actions has a very cool feature called secrets, where it can safely and securely store information like usernames and passwords. I'll show you how to use that now. So we'll go scroll up and we'll go to the Settings tab. And then we'll scroll down to Secrets. And we can see currently that there are no secrets for this repository. To create a secret, we click New Repository Secret. And then we put in the name of the secret. And this should be exactly how it's represented in the GitHub Actions YAML file. So one of them is the Docker username. And then I would put in my Docker username here. And I click Add Secret. Now any other collaborator to this repository can do things with this repository and basically use my Docker username now. However, they can't actually have access to the text. All they could do is click Remove or Update. And when they click Update, they don't get the value back. They just get the option of adding a new value. So when you go ahead and put your Docker password in there, you can be sure that your collaborators are not going to be able to look at your password. And furthermore, GitHub takes care to encrypt these passwords so that they're securely stored on, or fairly securely stored at least, on GitHub. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add the second secret that we need, which is the Docker password. And I'm going to pause the recording while I do this so I don't share this with you. Okay, we're back. I've now added my Docker password. So in theory, we should be able now to modify the Docker file on the main branch, which should trigger the GitHub Actions workflow to build a Docker image from the Docker file create a release tag on GitHub, publish that Docker image on Docker Hub, and also tag it with the same version number as the release tag on GitHub. So let's give that a try. So we'll do this just in a very small example way so we can follow this through easily. So we're on the main branch. We're going to go to the Docker file, and I'm going to make a small edit, and I'm going to do it by just adding a comment, okay? So basically any edit to this file will trigger the build, and I just want to do a small demonstration where I know it should build because it built successfully on my laptop, and I'm just adding this author comment here, so it should hopefully also build well with GitHub Actions. So I'm going to scroll down, and I'll say that I added the author, and I'm going to click on Commit Changes. Now, I know it doesn't look like much is happening, but if we go to the GitHub Actions tag, what do we see? Well, we see something different. We see this add author. Well, wait a minute. That was the name of the commit that we just did. And we see over here that things are queued. Oh, and now it's in progress. So things are happening. How can we see what's happening? Well, we can click on add author, and then we can click on the build. And then what we'll see is things are happening. So the runner has been set up, our code has been cloned onto it, it's going to start creating releases, and eventually it's going to get to the place where it's going to be building our Docker image and finally publishing it on Docker Hub. How do we know when it's all done? Well, we'll pay attention to this build over here on the left-hand side, and when it goes from yellow to green, that indicates that things are done and that they have worked out well. We have successfully built the thing we were building, which in this case is a Docker image, and publishing it to Docker Hub. If, however, the build does not turn into a green button, but instead it turns into a sad red X, then that means that something went wrong, and you can dig in through these logs that you're seeing here to try and figure out where things went astray, and you can try and fix them and run it again, either by, you will be able to find an option here of near the top that will let you rerun that job, but sometimes that's not enough and you need to trigger the workflow to go again. So again, I'm going to pause the video here so that you're not watching this for minutes and minutes and minutes build, and I will start it back up once the build is successful. And here we are. We have a green circle with a check mark that suggests that things worked well. But let's do a sanity check to make sure that they in fact did what we expected. So number one, let's check the releases for this GitHub repository to see if a release was created. And indeed it was, version 0.1.0. That's fantastic. Now let's head over to Docker Hub and take a look and see if there is a Docker image that exists now, and if it has the right tag too. So we're back here in the repository, Docker Hub repository, where the image should live, and I'm going to click on the Tags tab to take a look at what images now exist here and what tags that they have. And we can scroll down, and this is fantastic. We can see that we have an image with a tag that directly matches onto the release tag for the GitHub repository. We also have another tag because it's very common that when you build these images, you always have a tag that's called latest, and that is the name of the most recent thing that was built. And so this is a moving target. So this isn't a tag that you should necessarily be using when you are using something as a base image or trying to make your analysis reproducible. Instead, you want to use the tag here, or if such a thing doesn't exist, you could also use the digest here as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the lecture. So there we have it. We were able to use our GitHub action, which lives in here, that is triggered when we edit the Docker file on the main branch, to take that Docker file, make a Docker image on a GitHub runner, which is a computer on GitHub and the GitHub servers, and then authenticate using our GitHub Actions secrets to Docker Hub, and then publish our Docker image there. Pretty nice.